If it's good enough for Donkey Kong Bonanza and it's good enough for Pokemon Legend ZA, will there be DLC for Metroid Prime 4? In this video, we are going to look at the likelihoods of Metroid Prime 4 DLC and drill down into the specific roadblocks and opportunities Metroid Prime DLC would present. We're going to look at 6 different ways that Nintendo could approach this and why each one might have strengths and weaknesses. So first of all, how likely in a broad sense is Metroid Prime 4 DLC? In many respects, I think it seems like an absolutely obvious choice. Metroid Prime 4 had a huge production cost, and substantial DLC packs would be lapped up by its dedicated audience. We've seen with titles like Xenoblade and Fire Emblem that Nintendo tend to lean on higher price DLC packs to offset costs, and this makes a lot of sense in the case of Metroid, which has, after all, had a development that is nearly a decade long. If you have a fan base which is intensely dedicated and a game that has a huge budget, there is a great chance to recoup some of that outlay with a big DLC pack. We saw this with Breath of the Wild, where there was an expansion pass on day one, meaning that for those who bought the pass day one, it was effectively an $80 game. A Breath of the Wild strategy could certainly work for Metroid Prime 4. Because Breath of the Wild had 3 major stages to the expansion pass, a couple of extra things at launch, and then releases in summer and December, it kept people talking about Breath of the Wild all year long. There are other commonalities with Breath of the Wild too. There's clearly in Metroid Prime 4 a vast map to explore, so you just need to have a new area rise out of the desert with new traps and tricks and a new power-up or two in order to expand the world out. However, there is a risk here. Metroidvanias are different from other kinds of title. It's easy to see how you could staple on a few racing tracks, a few fighting characters and locations, a few Super Mario Bros. Courses into different styles of games. But Metroidvanias usually have a dense, interconnected world, and the characters build in capability and power to a crescendo at the final point. If you start with an endgame Samus, the risk is that there's not really very far to go. If you restart from a lower point, shades of the Xenoblade expansions, where the characters are usually much lower powered at the start of the side quest, the risk is that building a new area becomes hugely time consuming for uncertain financial return for Nintendo, and from an audience point of view, it's never going to have the same scale or satisfaction as a whole new game would. Now, Nintendo is pretty good at reutilizing older content, even in its DLCs. Breath of the Wild's DLC expertly stitched new content onto an old map and used various challenges to keep players interested. But for something as carefully balanced and perfected as Metroid Prime 4 is likely to have to be, it feels like a riskier proposition. Which is why I think we need to consider some alternatives to the Zelda Champions Ballad DLC style. One alternative, and one I wouldn't be keen on myself, but I think is worth at least mentioning, is the Luigi's Mansion 3 Scarescraper stratagem. Luigi's Mansion 3's Scarescraper DLC was not connected to the main game at all, but expanded the multiplayer options with a Scarescraper multiplayer mode. In certain respects, this was a great way to try something new and different in the shell of Luigi's Mansion 3, and I wouldn't be surprised if Scarescraper becomes a much bigger deal in Luigi's Mansion 4. However, it's not really the kind of DLC that would engage most people. Having said that, there might be particular advantages to this kind of strategy here. Even if a relatively small number of people own Metroid Prime 4, let alone the DLC, if those people are able to cast the game via GameShare, there's some potential for more people who might not normally be Metroid players to experience Metroid Prime. Now, while that works in theory, I think there are some stumbling blocks. First of all, I would guess that the older skewing Metroid Prime 4 audience are less likely to be game sharing as often as families, who are probably less likely to pick up the game. Second of all, if Metroid Prime 4 has a low audience to start with, adding a DLC which much of the core audience aren't bothered with represents a huge risk. Nintendo have shown an interest in multiplayer Metroid Prime before, but I don't think this is quite the time to do it. So let's look at another option, the Torna DLC style. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torna the Golden Country DLC isn't a follow-up directly, but rather a prequel to the original title, filling in the backstory of a group of characters, some of whom were antagonists in the main game. And here is where we need to talk about Sylux. The last time we had a main antagonist who was so close to Samus in terms of overall body shape, we had Dark Samus and the Metroid Prime 2 multiplayer mode. Sylux clearly isn't exactly the same as Samus, but it seems like you could effectively tell Sylux's story with different power-ups and story features mapped over what is largely the same terrain and a character who is largely similar in terms of proportion. The great advantage of this is that you leverage the scope of the existing world without it feeling repetitive to play through it again, as the way Sylux interacts with everything and the paths open to him would naturally be very different from those on offer to Samus. A decade ago, Kensuke Tanabe was interviewed in E3 2015, and he said, "There's still more I want to build around the story of Sylux and Samus. There's something going on between them. I want to make a game that touches upon it. I'm also thinking that in the eventual game between Sylux and Samus that might get made, that I want to involve the Galactic Federation as well. So it would be a good idea to release a game like Federation Force to flesh out its role in the galaxy before moving on to that." Now, Federation Force was not an enormously well-received game, and for anybody trying to follow the narrative of Metroid Prime 4, it's frankly unlikely that many people are going to be interested in revisiting it, even if they're among the small number of people who actually own it. Therefore, in theory, a game like this could actually be used to incorporate narrative points about the Federation Force Tanabe feels are important to spotlight. Personally, I think this sounds like the most compelling concept for a spin-off, and it does have a secondary benefit as well. Metroid is a major franchise for Nintendo in terms of prestige, but has rarely hit huge sales. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Xenoblade is another franchise with generally modest sales, but making prestige games like this has broader benefits for Nintendo's reputation within the industry and for players' perception of the breadth of titles on offer for Nintendo content. However, one of the major shots Metroid has in its locker is to enter the audiovisual space with a film or movie or television show. The games are intrinsically narrative rich and cinematic in a way that most Nintendo franchises aren't. The odds of it being a hit are probably fairly long, but the potential payoff is huge if they can get it right. Now, any such movie would need antagonists, and while Ridley is the obvious choice, Ridley also would surely need hugely expensive CGI. Sylux strikes me as being far simpler to render, as you would need a person in a suit. Even Power Rangers could pull that one off. Therefore, it strikes me that Sylux actually has a good deal more utility to them commercially than Ridley in the medium term, even though Ridley is clearly the more iconic and dramatic foe, and I'm sure will remain iconic and important to the Metroid franchise as a whole. Now, I think the decision to focus on Sylux evidently preceded the current film strategy at Nintendo, since it's clear that Tanabe was talking about this as far back as 2015 and therefore surely thinking about it long before that as well. But the decision to build in DLC might not have been quite so long ago, and therefore it could have been the case that they wanted to press Sylux into the spotlight all the more. Okay, so there's the Champions, Ballad, Scarescraper and Torna DLC approaches. However, there's also the Bonanza strategy. Take what appears to be a final reward area, build in some kind of extra challenge mode set in old locations, and shove it out the door quite soon and at quite a low price. This would work if you're in a huge rush to make another game, but Retro Studios have never produced a true top-tier game in terms of sales. Donkey Kong Country Returns was very successful, although on the larger install base, and the original Metroid Prime was actually a pretty big hit if you adjust for the GameCube's lower volume sold. It could be that Retro's next game is the big one, particularly if they're returning to Donkey Kong Country in advance of a big Donkey Kong movie, something I will address in a separate video, but seems a lot more plausible to me than some seem to be asserting at present. If a quickie DLC is shoved out the door, it would suggest to me that they might be going this route, and of course, we do expect Metroid 6 to be along sooner or later if that is in development with Mercury Steam, and that it may not require Nintendo to commit to supporting Metroid Prime 4 too long term with content as a result. I can certainly see how this might come to pass, but I think the opportunity to do something a little higher effort, but significantly more expensive, might feel like a missed opportunity for Nintendo, and I think the kind of DLC profile that would suit a franchise like Metroid feels far closer to Fire Emblem and Xenoblade than something like Donkey Kong Bonanza. However, there is a fifth DLC strategy, and this is the Metroid Dread approach. Dread had a couple of post-support tweaks, but to all intents and purposes, it was done and dusted when it dropped. The game was excellent and highly replayable, but it didn't have, and probably wouldn't especially benefit from, at least narratively, any extra DLC. Now, all that said, note that the game released in the second half of the Switch's life, when DLC was suddenly starting to dry up. Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and even Zelda Tears of the Kingdom didn't get anything to expand them either, although of course all of those did get Nintendo Switch 2 editions. There is a logic in saying we've completed the game, but now it's time to move on and do something new rather than trying to gild the lily with small tweaks on an existing title. This will especially be the case if Metroid Prime 4 has a highly successful narrative. Even huge, lavish games like Super Mario Odyssey didn't lead to direct DLC add-ons except for tiny elements like Balloon Hunt, so I think we can't count Metroid DLC out. Having said that, both Odyssey and Dread at least got something. Metroid Dread added challenge modes and a rookie mode. I wonder if some of this came from Sakamoto's stated wish up front to force the player to adapt to a harder challenge level, as he felt that this was important for the game, and then Nintendo going, okay, you've done your core game for the fans, now it's time to make this title accessible to the broader gaming public. However, there is one left field option which I will mention as well, and that is the Labo DLC strategy. Both Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey received DLC to allow the games to be played with VR, and of course Nintendo is launching its own Virtual Boy headset. Does it feel like the sort of thing Nintendo would do if they took their most lavishly expensive first-person game ever, a game in an iconic and much requested franchise, and then made it compatible with their Virtual Boy toy? I mean, yes. Yes, it really does. As far as I can tell, there's really no limitation in terms of the design of the new Virtual Boy machine. There's some kind of plastic sheath over the eyes, but I don't think they appear red because the lens is tinted, but rather because the casing itself is red and it's just reflecting that colour. It wouldn't really make much sense to me to have a red filter for a game that already looks red. I could easily see Nintendo therefore doing a February Direct and announcing that alongside their Virtual Boy releasing later this week, you can now play Metroid Prime 4 using the Virtual Boy. Virtual Boy Metroid Prime 4 is something nobody asked for and is absolutely absurd, and therefore must happen. Okay, so I've mapped out 6 different approaches they could take, from the Breath of the Wild approach of having a larger expansion pass, to the Scare-Scraper stratagem of having something more multiplayer focused, to the Torna DLC style, where they are reinventing the story through a different perspective, to the quicker and less in-depth Donkey Kong Bonanza approach, to the Metroid Dread small update strategy, to, well, having the game playable through the Virtual Boy. However, let's now map out the likelihoods. I will give my personal perspective with percentage forecasts. The percents, as ever, aren't based on some deep mathematical calculation, but rather just a way for me to track back in the future and see how right or wrong I was, and whether if I say something feels 90% likely, then that actually does come to pass around 90% of the time. So, I think any kind of post-launch content for Metroid Prime 4 does feel like a 70% shot, even if it's a tiny free something or other. It's quite rare with these high-effort titles that they don't do anything to keep juicing them after launch. Now, this could be something incredibly minor, but let's define it as more than game stabilization and bug fixes, something that is worth a mention discreetly from Nintendo at least. Paid DLC, I also feel, has a pretty strong likelihood. It makes sense to me to see this title following the Fire Emblem and Xenoblade approach, and so while there are other reasons why Nintendo may wish to be more cautious, I'm still going to give that option a 50% chance. The only reason not to do so would be to move on quickly, but frankly, even if Retro are employed with other things, Nintendo also has collaborators such as Metroid Prime Remastered collaborators Iron Galaxy, who might be able to put out a DLC pack. I guess the issue here is cost as opposed to the potential return on investment. The nature of the DLC is a little bit trickier. Obviously, my hope would be for some kind of significant Torna-style expansion, perhaps featuring Sylux in the lead. It's difficult to necessarily forecast the precise shape of what DLC could be, but let's make it easier by settling price guidelines first of all. I think a $20 plus DLC pack feels 30% probable, and perhaps even more expensive, $25 or $30, would be a definite option, as these are more common for expansions of this nature. This would put it closer to the scale of Nintendo's more niche titles and strikes me as the most effective way to monetize Metroid Prime 4, turning it from a $70 title into, for a significant chunk of the audience, a $100 title. It's basic economics. If you have something with very high demand and a high cost to make, then you can raise the price. But given there are other market forces that make raising the price too much a bit tricky, such as backlash from the gaming public who already saw about $80 Mario Kart, then they would need to approach it in a different way, in this case via DLC. One thing that feels less likely at this point is a formal expansion pass, as it just feels like they would have announced this already if it were ever going to be on the cards. Therefore, I would guess that the most likely outcome is a whim mention of the game in early 2026. Virtual Boy Metroid Prime 4 compatibility feels like a 30% shout, and then perhaps the announcement of a full DLC in a September 2026 Nintendo Direct. Of course, I may revisit this topic again if new information comes to light, or if people notice holes in this logic, so please do get into the comment section to share your own perspectives. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.